Thanks for that wonderful introduction. So, as Nestor said, I'm currently a PhD student in social psychology at Ohio State University over in Columbus. Over there, I study with Robert Arkin and Jennifer Carker on topics related to narcissism, including things like agency, social comparison, and intimate relationships. But I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about the research that I did with my collaborator Amani L. O'Leary at Eastern Washington University on some research looking at narcissism in relation to self-serving attributional bias in collaborative team outcomes. All right, so we all have to work in partnerships in various aspects of our lives, throughout our lives, in places like school, in work, with our friends, in extracurricular activities, all kinds of scenarios where that happens. And I'm sure if you recall back to the past times that you have done that, sometimes it's been pretty easy, and sometimes maybe it's been kind of difficult. And in particular, sometimes the type of person you had to work with made it easy, and sometimes the type of person made it hard. So I'm going to talk to you today about one particular kind of person who is very hard to work with, and that is a narcissist. All right, so first, what do I mean when I'm talking about narcissism? I think it's important to point out that I am a social psychologist, not a clinical psychologist. So I look at trait narcissism, not narcissistic personality disorder. Now, the personality disorder, of course, occurs in clinical disordered populations. It's very categorical. Either you have the disorder or you don't. In contrast, I take a trait approach to narcissism, so I view it as a personality characteristic that everybody differs on. So it's a spectrum or a continuum. It's normally distributed in the population. So everybody in this room, if you took a narcissism measure, would score somewhere on that continuum. Could be really high, could be really low, could be something more moderate. But the point is, it's normally distributed. Everybody is, to some degree, narcissistic. So when I'm talking about trait narcissism, this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of person who has a grandiose sense of self-importance. They're very self-absorbed. They think about themselves all the time. Importantly, this leads to a lack of empathy for others, so they're less able to take the perspectives of other people. They just care a lot less about other people because they're so wrapped up in themselves. They feel very entitled to good outcomes. So this is the kind of person who says, I deserve X, Y, and Z, all these fantastic things because I'm just so great. Of course I deserve these things. They're very confident and outgoing, and they're also impulsive and can be very aggressive. They have highly inflated self-esteem, so this is the kind of person who thinks that they're really wonderful and fantastic, and that's very genuine. It's not a false sense of inflated self-esteem. They actually really truly believe what they think about themselves. And probably most pertinent to the talk that I'm giving today, they tend to exaggerate their own achievements. Now, exaggerating your own achievements, this is something that everybody does to some extent. You perform well on anything, you're going to say, well, it was because I was really good. But the point is that narcissists do this to a really extreme degree, much more than the average population does. All right, so they can be really difficult to get along with in any kind of a social relationship. So I'll give you an overview of what some past research has found on this topic. Importantly, narcissists are very charming and popular at first acquaintance. So you meet a narcissist, and at first glance, you want to know them better. You want to talk to them more. You want to be their friend. They're charming. They're awesome. But the longer that interaction goes on, the more that wears off. So a really strong positive first impression tends to really devolve and spiral downward into a more negative evaluation over time as people really get to know narcissists. Narcissists are also very highly punitive in response to ego threats or insults or negative feedback. So I walk up to a narcissist and I insult them, they're going to want to get back at me to put me in my place. Notably, this is very punitive in nature. They don't just lash out at anybody indiscriminately. They really target the person who they view as a transgressor to get back at them. In the workplace, as you might imagine, narcissism can be a challenge. Narcissists actually strive to be leaders. They think they're great. Of course, they would be wonderful leaders. And perhaps scarily, they tend to succeed in getting leadership positions. So one study found that narcissists' management applications for a management position were very favorably evaluated even by experienced personnel selectors. So the people who are deciding who gets to be a leader are choosing narcissists. And once narcissists are in those positions, of course, this can lead to some very bad outcomes. So narcissism in leadership is associated with corruption and very extremely overly self-centered behavior. So of course, narcissists we talked about are very highly entitled. They think they deserve wonderful things. And when they're in a leadership position, they will go to great lengths to get those things for themselves, including engaging in illicit behaviors and illegal behaviors. Not ideal, right? Even in employees, narcissism is associated with some problems. So narcissistic employees tend to commit more counterproductive work behaviors. So what I mean by that is things like corporate theft, overbilling for hours worked. So I work 5 hours, but I bill you for 10. And of course, aggression toward their coworkers. In school environments, this is also known to be a problem. So narcissism is associated with academic dishonesty. They're more likely to cheat, and they're less likely to feel guilty about it. In addition, narcissism is associated with bullying behavior. So they're much more willing to bully other people, and this is due to what's called approval of aggression beliefs. So that just means that narcissists view aggression as very normative. They think it's normal, they think it's okay, they think it's acceptable. It's an acceptable way to get what they want. So they're much more willing and likely to bully other people. In any kind of a group, narcissists can be a problem. So studies have shown that they tend to make more competitive than cooperative choices when working in various types of groups. So this choice to make more competitive choices tends to result in gains to the narcissistic individual because they're getting the things that they want, but it results in losses to everybody else in the group and even to the group as a whole. They're especially prone to engage in self-serving behavior and make self-serving attributions when working in groups. Now this brings us to the crux of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today, which revolves around something called self-serving attributional bias. I'll define that for you. Self-serving attributional bias in collaborative teams is the tendency for people to take more credit than they truly deserve for the team's outcome, and when it's a success, and to take less credit than they truly deserve for a team failure. Now, everybody does this. This is a pervasive bias. We're motivated to see ourselves in a positive light. We have our own self-esteem to think about, and we want to keep it as high as possible. So we're going to really claim credit for successes and distance ourselves from failures. Interestingly, though, there's a difference in how this can be expressed. So people tend to be less self-serving in public contexts than in private contexts. So the reason for this is that people are sensitive, generally sensitive to the social evaluations of engaging in this type of bias in groups. So if I'm working in a group and we have a success, we have a really good performance, and somebody higher up says, okay, who was responsible for this? Who did the most work? If I'm standing in front of my group mates and I say, it was me, nobody else did anything, people know that that's not going to go over well. Their group mates are going to be really irritated and annoyed, and it's going to harm their interactions. So that's why in private, people are willing to say, well, it was me, I did the best. But in public, they're much less likely to actually express this bias that they have. Of course, unsurprisingly, narcissists are especially likely to make self-serving attributions. So everybody does this, right? Everybody does this in the population. But narcissists do this to an even greater degree. They take the most credit for team successes and the least blame for team failures. So this is a well-established phenomenon that narcissism is associated with self-serving bias. But I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit more and figure out, okay, are there conditions where this happens the most, and are there maybe conditions where this effect can be wiped out for narcissists? So my research questions were as follows. I wanted to know, do narcissists make more self-serving attributions? Do they engage in this bias more or less if these attributions are made publicly or privately? So the idea here is that they may be sensitive to the opportunity for glory. So previous studies have shown that narcissists' actual performance is much better in public situations where public recognition is at stake versus in private situations. So for example, a narcissistic football player who's on a team might put less work in and be less concerned with good performance in a practice where nobody is watching versus in the game where everybody's watching. Then they may really excel. So I figured, well, maybe this is happening with how they make self-serving attributions as well. They may care more about the opportunity for public recognition than about the opportunity to do this, to engage in this bias in a more private manner. I also wanted to know, is this effect moderated by teammate relationship type, whether the narcissist is working with a friend or a stranger? So the term moderated just refers to an interaction between variables, and I'll walk you a little bit through what that means in a minute if you're unsure. And the rationale here is that I think narcissists might be insensitive to social costs. So they may be less likely to be aware of what the costs will be if they throw their friend under the bus versus a stranger. So they may actually disregard this difference in terms of a teammate relationship type and be self-serving equally regardless of who their teammate is. And additionally, is this effect moderated by team outcomes? So whether they're experiencing a team success or a team failure, does this change the outcome? Is one condition more likely to produce more self-serving bias than the other? So the rationale here is that we know that narcissists are really able to externalize and trivialize failures. So they do poorly on something, they're able to say, okay, I don't care, this has no bearing on me. But when they succeed in something, they really jump on it, they capitalize. They want everyone to know, look at the success I had, I'm great. Now, the first question about public versus private, this is constant across the two studies that I'll talk about today. Second question about teammate relationship type, I'll only talk about in the first study. And the third question about outcome, I'll only talk about in the second study. All right, so again, I'll walk you through two studies that I've done. First, I'll tell you about the method, how I tested these predictions. Then I'll walk you through the results, what we actually found, and then help interpret what that means. So predictions for study one. I thought that narcissists would be more self-serving, make more self-serving attributions for a team's success when those attributions are public than when they're private. So again, the rationale here is that they really highly value public approval and admiration, and they care much less about private self-bolstering. I predict that this effect will not be moderated by teammate relationship type. In other words, it will not be different depending on whether the teammate is a stranger or a friend. So the rationale here is that narcissists care more about recognition than they care about interpersonal relationships, so they won't be sensitive to that difference in social relationship. All right, so how did I test this? We had 169 undergraduate psychology student participants from a Northwestern university. They all participated for course credit. Gender breakdown was 66% female, which is pretty standard, at least in the university that we completed this research at. Mean age 19.28, right around the freshman-sophomore range. The design, we had 3 independent variables. Narcissism, which as we talked about earlier, is measured continuously. Attributional context, whether it was public or private, 2 conditions. And teammate relationship type, whether it was a friend or a stranger they were working with, again, 2 conditions. So because we have 3 independent variables here, one of which is continuously measured, the other 2 are manipulated and dichotomous, we use a technique called multiple regression analysis. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry. I'll walk you through some of the basics so that when I show you the results, you'll be able to better understand what it means. Multiple regression analysis is used to determine which independent variables are the best predictors of the dependent variables. So what is going to predict self-serving attributional bias the best? The nice thing about multiple regression analysis is that it allows us to have all 3 variables in one equation. So again, our 3 variables in this study are narcissism, public-private context, and friend-stranger teammate. So this lets us determine which of these 3 variables, or does some combination of these 3 variables, best predict self-serving attributional bias. So what we're looking for in this study is actually a 2-way interaction. So I'll try to explain what this means in terms of a Venn diagram. So here we have our 3 independent variables, right? Narcissism, public-private, and friend-stranger. Now, any one of these independent variables might best predict self-serving attributional bias. For example, narcissism alone might be the best predictor of self-serving attributional bias. Or perhaps the public-private condition alone might be the best predictor of self-serving attributional bias. These are both perfectly plausible explanations. And again, these independent variables may work alone or in combination to best predict self-serving attributional bias, and I'm predicting that they're working in combination. In particular, I think it's this combination of narcissism and public-private context that's going to best predict self-serving attributional bias. So looking for a 2-way interaction here. Still with me? All right. So we measured narcissism using the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. This is a 40-item measure. All of the items are forced choice, meaning participants are showed 2 statements and must select the one that they identify with the most. So some examples of statements on this inventory would be, I know that I'm good because everybody keeps telling me so, versus when people compliment me, I sometimes get embarrassed. Or it makes me uncomfortable to be the center of attention, versus I really like to be the center of attention. You can probably guess which ones are the more narcissistic items here. But it's these 2, if you weren't sure. After the narcissism measure, participants read a vignette. So this was a hypothetical study. They imagined a situation occurring. So this is what they read. Imagine you and your friend, or a stranger, so this is our manipulation of teammate relationship type, have reached the final round on a TV game show similar to Fear Factor. You're participating in a team competition with 5 teams of 2 partners each. Imagine that the show, which will be nationally televised, will reward the winning pair with $100,000 to share. Your assignment is to walk on tall stilts for 200 yards along a path while grabbing flags attached to tree branches. Your partner's assignment is to complete the same task at the same time in a different location. Everyone is told at the beginning of the team that the team that has the combined lowest time after acquiring all of the flags would be the grand prize winner. As you converse with your partner, you learn that neither one of you has ever walked on stilts before. You both mentally prepare for the task as a stagehand walks over to deliver 2 sets of stilts. If you thought that the stilts and tree branch grabbing task was kind of weird, it was intentionally that way because we didn't want participants to have preconceived notions about how they would perform on a task. So if I said it's going to be a math test, and you know that you're really bad at math, then when your team succeeds, you might say, well, it's not because of me, because I'm bad at math, so it must have been the partner. We wanted to get rid of that kind of preconceived notion and make it a task that participants probably had never done before. Don't know if anybody walks around on stilts and grabs branches in their spare time. And then the end of the vignette is that they're imagining that 10 minutes later, congratulations, your combined team beat all of the other teams. You've won the grand prize in a nationally televised competition. After reading the vignette, participants were asked to answer some attributional questions. So they imagine answering these questions about their experience in the competition in a nationally broadcasted TV interview, that's the public context, versus in a confidential survey, that's the private context. We define the extent of self-serving attributional bias in our participants in 2 ways. First, as the percentage of responsibility that participants gave to themselves minus their partner. So first we gave them a scale from 0 to 100 and asked them to indicate how much of that they had earned for their team versus their partner. And second, the amount of the $100,000 prize money that participants thought that they earned minus what they thought their partner earned. All right, so what did we find? First, I'm going to orient you to the graph so that when I show you the data points, you'll be able to better understand what you're looking at. So first off, this is the graph for the percentage responsibility DV. It's the one where they had 100% to divide up between them and their partner. So if you look on the y-axis of each of these graphs, we have a 0 point, which would be an equal distribution of the 100% of responsibility between the self and the partner. Anything lower than 0 is giving more responsibility to the partner. Anything higher than 0 is giving more responsibility to the self. On the x-axis here, we have narcissism ranging from low to high, and again, we're particularly interested in high narcissists. Of course, you've probably noticed that there are 2 graphs on this screen. That's because one of them is depicting the results for people in the friend condition, who imagine going through the task with their friend, and the other one is showing the results for the stranger condition. Here's the legend for the graph. When I show you the data points, you're going to see that the blue line is showing you what's happening in the public condition. The red line is showing you what's happening in the private condition. All right, so we ended up finding a significant 3-way interaction. So that means that all 3 of our variables interacted to best predict self-serving attributional bias. And here's what that looks like. So first I want to draw your attention to the friend graph. Here you see that we don't have very much going on. Everybody is hovering pretty close to the 0 point of being equal in their distribution of responsibility. You might be able to see this very, very slight incline, but it's not statistically significant. And people in the public and private conditions don't differ from each other significantly either. But if you look over at the stranger condition, we have something very exciting happening over here. So in particular, I'll draw your attention to these 2 points because, again, we're really interested in the high narcissists in our sample. So if you look here in the private condition with the red point in high narcissism, this is above the 0 point. So when they're making these attributions privately, narcissists are claiming more responsibility. But if you look at the blue point, the stranger condition, for the high narcissists, they're claiming a lot of responsibility. This is almost up to 25%. That means they're claiming almost 25% more responsibility than what they're giving to their partner. So this matches our predictions really nicely when at least in terms of this public success. Narcissists are much more self-serving when they're experiencing a public success even than when they're experiencing a private success. But the fact that we have a three-way interaction means that, of course, the conditions between friend and stranger are significantly different. I had predicted that there would be no difference between friend and stranger because I didn't think that they were sensitive to social relationships, but it turns out that they are. So the high narcissists who are imagining going through this with a friend are hovering around the midpoint, just like the low narcissists. So they don't seem to be willing to throw their friend under the bus to gain more responsibility credit for themselves. Very interesting. For the sake of time, I won't show you the graph for the prize money DV, but the exact same pattern is showing up there, where they're actually dividing the $100,000 prize money. They're also taking much more credit, much more of that money, when they're in the public condition and when they were imagining working with a stranger, not a friend. All right, so this shows us that narcissists exhibit the most self-serving attributional bias when making public attributions with a stranger as a teammate. So they're more self-serving in public than in private, matching that prediction. But they're actually only self-serving when the partner is a stranger, not when they're a friend. So this gives us some additional insight into what situations narcissists are the most self-serving in. Now for study 2, I wanted to extend this finding a little bit more. I wanted to replicate the finding in terms of public versus private. But as you remember, we already had 3 variables in study 1, and a three-way interaction is interpretable. But I wanted to add another variable of looking at the difference between success and failure conditions. And if I had added that to the 3 variables from before, we would have 4 independent variables, and 4-way graphs are a pain to interpret. So instead, I ended up dropping the friend-stranger condition, but I have plans for that in the future, which I'll tell you about at the end of the talk today, and added the success-failure condition. So the predictions for study 2 were that narcissists would make more self-serving attributions for a team outcome when their attributions are made in public than when they're made in private. So I'm expecting to replicate study 1. And I think this effect will be moderated by team outcome. So I think that narcissists care much more about successes than they care about failures, because again, they're much more easily able to brush off those failures and think that doesn't really apply to me, versus the successes, they really want to capitalize on those. And so again, they use successes to bolster the self, but they can externalize and trivialize failures. Importantly, I wanted to see if these effects that we found in study 1 are going to hold true in an in vivo scenario. So remember, study 1, participants were imagining a situation where they're competing in something like fear factor, right? It's very easy, it's a common thing in social psychology to look at whether what people say they would do is the same as what they actually do. So I wanted to take it from a hypothetical context to an actual team partnership context and see if the results change or stay the same. So the method, what we use to test these predictions, is a little different from before. We again have undergraduate psychology students, this time 138 of them. They again participated for course credit, 67% female, mean age of 20.25. Same design as last time, same basic design. We have narcissism measured continuously, attributional context, a public and a private condition, and feedback condition, success or failure. And we again use multiple regression analysis to test these predictions. All right. So we ended up using a different narcissism measure this time, but it achieves the same basic effect. This time we used the pathological narcissism inventory, specifically the exploitativeness subscale, which consists of 5 items, rated on a scale from 1, which indicates strongly disagree, to 5, which indicates strongly agree. Here are some examples of these items. I find it easy to manipulate people. Everybody likes to hear my stories. This time, participants competed in a cognitive tasks competition. So they were told that they were going to be completing a series of cognitive tasks on the computer with a partner as part of a competition between teams of participants. They were told that they were each completing the tasks separately, but that their scores would be added or combined together to determine their team's result. And they were told that their partner would be seated at a separate computer in the lab or in another lab. Actually, the partner was fictitious. We didn't actually care that much about how they would work with an actual partner, but we wanted them to think that they had a partner that their work was being judged in comparison with, so that they believed there was an actual person at stake when they were making the attributions that we're asking of them later. The first task of the cognitive tasks was to list creative uses for a brick. The second was to unscramble scrambled words. And the third was to recall number strings. These might seem like kind of odd tasks, but the reason we chose them was so that the participants would feel sort of ambiguous about how they had performed. They weren't sure if they did really well or really poorly, so that when we gave them randomly assigned success or failure feedback, they'd be more likely to believe it. All right, after the cognitive competition task, participants completed attribution questions. They were asked about their experiences in the competition and told that their responses either would be shown to the experimenter and their partner, this was the public attributional context, or that it would not, and that's the private attributional context. They were also asked to divide up 30 minutes of bonus credit, so we told them that they had earned a prize. In the success condition, we told them it was a prize for winning the competition. In the failure condition, we told them it was a consolation prize, that we had these 30 minutes of bonus credit that would be divided up between the participant and their partner. So in this study, we defined the extent of self-serving attributional bias, first as the percentage of responsibility participants gave to themselves. This is very similar to the first study. This is the response scale that we gave them. So if you see here, higher responses on this scale are indicating greater responsibility given to the self. You see 100% you, 0% partner up at the very top there. The lower you get on here, the more percentage of responsibility you give to your partner in comparison to yourself. Our other dependent variable here was the amount of bonus credit the participants gave to themselves. So we told them to actually divide up those 30 minutes of research credit between the partner and them. Same basic scale here. The higher scores are indicating taking more bonus credit for the self and giving less to the partner, versus the lower you get in this scale, the more bonus credit you're giving to the partner, the less you're keeping for yourself. All right. So graphs in the same basic format as last time. Again, we have a personal responsibility dependent variable, but this time the scale is a little bit different. So on this scale, a score of 6 would be the midpoint of exactly equal distribution between the self and the partner. Again, though, the lower you get in this scale, the more you give to your partner. The higher you get, the more you take for yourself. And we also have two graphs, but of course this time they're depicting different variables. So this time we have a success graph and a failure graph. Otherwise, the legend is the same, public-private, and the narcissism on the x-axis is also the same. So for this DV, happily, we also found a significant three-way interaction, meaning again that all three of our variables interacted to best predict self-serving attributional bias. So here's what that actually looks like in the graph. First, I want to draw your attention to the failure portion of the graph. You can see here we don't have a lot of variability in those lines. They're actually not significantly different from each other. Not much is going on over here. Everybody's kind of hovering around a little bit above the midpoint. But in the success condition, in particular these 2 points for high narcissism, here we have our interaction. So again, just like in the last study, we have the same basic pattern. In a success condition, high narcissists are claiming more responsibility in a public context than they are in a private context. Versus, of course, in the failure condition, they're not doing that same thing. So indicating that they probably do care a lot less about failures versus what they care about successes when they can really capitalize on that. And again, I won't show you it for the purposes of time, but for that bonus research credit DV, we see the same pattern going on, where participants are actually giving themselves the most credit in a public success condition, and they're dividing it a lot more equally in the failure condition. All right. This is very exciting, of course. We see again, narcissists exhibit the most self-serving attributional bias when making public attributions for a team success. So they're more self-serving in public than in private in general, replicating study 1. And they're more self-serving after a success than after a failure. So they care much more about making those attributions after their team has succeeded, and they care a lot less about doing that after their team has failed. All right, that was our two studies. Now I'll tell you a little bit about what this really means in terms of past literature and perhaps in terms of your daily lives. And I'll talk to you also about some future directions of the research that I'm hoping to do to expand on these basic findings. So of course, in both of our studies, we saw that narcissists make more self-serving attributions for team outcomes in public than in private. This is driven by their desire for public recognition and admiration. They care a lot less about making these attributions privately because nobody's going to hear that. They want other people to know how great they are. They make more self-serving attributions for team outcomes when paired with a stranger than with a friend. Saw this in study 1. So they do seem to be aware of the social costs of expressing this bias when their partner is somebody that they know and that they presumably like. Whereas when it's a stranger, they're very willing to engage in this bias, even at the cost of the stranger. And study 2 showed us that they make more self-serving attributions for team successes than team failures. So again, they care much more about success. They really want people to know that they were responsible for that success and they deserve the recognition, they deserve the credit for it. And they care a lot less about doing that when the team has failed. All right, these findings have implications for team projects in school, for example, in a college campus or even in a secondary or primary education status as well. Anytime you have team projects, this kind of context can come to play. Same thing in the workplace. If you have a group of coworkers doing a presentation in front of the boss, and then later the boss asks, who had this idea? Narcissists might be more likely to pipe up and say, oh, it was me, it was me. But of course, it's important to keep in mind that there's a trade-off between public and private contexts. So as we talked about at the beginning of the talk, everybody engages in self-serving attributional bias, but most people engage in it much more in private than in public. Whereas we see a reversal of that effect with narcissists. They do it a lot more in public than in private. So in any kind of situation where somebody is asking for things like peer evaluations, it's important to keep in mind what kind of context you're asking for that in. If you're just walking up to a group of people and asking them, you might get a narcissist more likely to pipe up and claim the credit. Versus if you have people do confidential surveys, the narcissists might be less likely to do that, and our non-narcissistic people might be more likely to do that. This is also one reason why those programs that are aimed at fostering community in schools and in workplaces are so important. This is a very strong application here. The more you know each other, the more you consider yourselves friends, perhaps the less likely a narcissist is to take advantage of their coworkers. Some future directions that I have spinning off of this project. First, of course, these 2 studies were conducted in a college student population. We love studying college students in psychology, and we love seeing what they do. But of course, college students do not represent the entire population, so one thing to do with this line of research next is to look at whether this happens in an actual workplace. Does it happen the same there as it does among college students, or are there some differences of some kind? This would allow us to get a much more diverse range of participants as well in terms of age, perhaps education, background, all those other key things that we like to look at in terms of different populations. Another future direction that I'm really excited to get started on this coming year is looking at something that we're calling practical communion. So practical communion is the idea that people are sensitive to social relationships, to hierarchies, who's above them and who's below them, and they may behave differently around people who have different social status than them. So I want to look at, okay, how sensitive are narcissists to these social hierarchies? We saw in study 1, right, that they are aware of the costs of claiming more credit from their friend than from their stranger. And I want to know if this extends even farther. So I want to know, do narcissists have a tendency to suck up and bully down? So they know that certain people are above them and certain people are below them. Do they change their behavior depending on that social status? So if I want a promotion and I'm a jerk to my boss, I'm not going to get it, right? But if I'm really nice to my boss and I give them a birthday present, they might like me more and give me a promotion. So I want to know if narcissists have this same mentality and perhaps if they're even more likely to modify their behavior in these ways. Because again, they're very entitled, right? They want good things for themselves. I want to know how far are they going to go to get that. Some concluding thoughts from this talk. Be vigilant of any attempts by narcissistic teammates to publicly take credit for team successes in your daily lives, especially if this is going to result in unfair distribution of credit, resources, and rewards. Be aware when you're working in groups, especially if you don't know those people very well. And if you're not sure if someone you know is a narcissist, you might try asking them. You'd think this wouldn't work, but it does. There's some great research out recently developing something called the single item narcissism scale. And this is what it sounds like. It's one item. It says, to what extent do you agree with this statement? I am a narcissist. Note, the word narcissist means egotistical, self-focused, and vain. What do you know? People who score high on more subtle measures of narcissism endorse this item. They say, yep, I'm a narcissist. That's me. It sounds unreal, but 9+ studies in this paper showed this effect. So try asking them, but don't offend them, so take that with a grain of salt. That's very true. That's very true. Yeah, those studies didn't look at any kind of a... That'd be interesting to see if you ask a narcissist if they are narcissistic, are they offended or not? My guess would be no, because I think the reason that they endorse this item is because they think these are good things to be. They're like, a narcissist? That's great, that's what I am. Self-focused, of course I am, I'm wonderful. Vain, well I have a reason to be vain, so yeah, I'm vain. So my guess would be if you ask somebody if they're a narcissist and they're not, they'd be like, yeah. But if you ask somebody who's not a narcissist if they are, you might run into some trouble. All right, thanks so much for coming, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah?
So if you had, so I teach this
That would be so fun.
in most of these scenarios, I imagine the narcissist, they are the only one, and they're saying that you work with a partner, where the partner is like, I'm doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't know of any research that definitively answers that, but I do know that people have found that narcissists tend to evaluate each other pretty positively, at least in terms of their attributes, maybe not so much their actions. So that might be a solution. Try it and see if it works. You would definitely protect your non-narcissist at the very least. Yeah? Yeah, so we use psychology students when they take Psychology 101 or 105, whatever the intro class is. A lot of the time, there's a course requirement in that class to participate in research. It can be substituted for completing papers, just so nobody feels obligated to do the research, but of course, who wants to write more papers? So most people will choose the experiment option, and they're able to sign up. It's often online for studies that match with their time schedules. So we have participants sign up for a study that matches with their time schedule and come into the lab, and then they complete our study. And we give them credit, and then they get their grade that they want. Yeah? Right, that's a good question. Well, one way to do it would be to have the work be very public. So if you're having people work together in classes, make it a presentation where they're going to have to perform it. There's probably going to be, there may or may not be some issues in the development of the presentation stage where people feel like the narcissist is slacking off, but more than likely they're going to come through because they know that the outcome of their group work is going to be public, and people are going to watch them, give a presentation or do some kind of an activity. So that might be one way to do it. The more sort of individualized and non-public the situation is, probably the more likely you're going to get a slacking off effect. Okay. Right, that's very true. I think there's a lot of research that shows that narcissists are not very ideal relationship partners, which is probably not surprising, but they tend to, for example, have very low relationship commitment. And they actually, this might be interesting to you, they actually tend to engage in relationships for status enhancement purposes rather than looking for warm and caring relationships. So if given a choice between being in a relationship with somebody who will elevate them by association, they're going to choose that person over somebody who actually cares about them. So they may actually create the kind of relationship in which this isn't as much of a problem, because you're much more likely to get somebody who's more sensitive to this kind of an issue in people who are actually invested in each other for who they are versus invested in each other for what they can do for each other. Does that help? That's very true. The thing about that, though, is that that's less likely to happen in terms of an intimate relationship that the person is choosing. Because if they're able to bully that person, that usually means that that person is a lower status than them, and they don't want to have this impression that they're being dragged down by somebody who's a lower status than them. So I think that's, I'm sure that happens, but it's much less likely to happen because they're more likely to pick somebody who's at least on an equal plane with them, if not a little bit higher, but probably not too much higher. So the bullying is probably less likely to happen if they feel that they're equals. Comes more into play if you're working with somebody who you don't know and you don't really care about. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I haven't. I'm more focused on that second one that I'm doing rather than the first, but I would love to do the first. Honestly, it depends a lot on how I would be able to get a hold of people in the workplace. There's a lot of sort of issues with getting into that kind of a population. But I am hoping to start work on, for example, some dyads work of people in the community, so I might see if there's some way I can get into a workplace as well. So good question. The answer is I'm not sure yet, but I'm hoping to figure that out sometime. Yeah. No, so that's a good question. We don't measure any kind of narcissistic personality disorder, partly because it's rare. It's got about a 1% prevalence rate in the population, and that probably holds for college students. So if we had 100 participants in one study, we might have one person who would qualify. So we don't do any kind of a screening for that. But it's likely that if somebody does have that personality disorder, they probably would end up falling into our narcissist category. So we never really check for that, but it might be a good thing to do. It might. Narcissistic personality disorder is somewhat different than the trait approach. So let's see how specific I can get here. I think most people, when they think of narcissistic personality disorder and the way it's actually diagnosed, it tends to be this idea of what's called the mask hypothesis, where the person is very grandiose and narcissistic as sort of a front, like an outer front, but on the inside they're very vulnerable and very insecure. And that's very different from how we think about trait narcissism. Obviously it has some commonalities, but it's not the same thing. So we worry a bit less about it being askew than maybe if it was more similar. But that's a really good point. Oh yeah, yeah. I would, yes. My somewhat professional opinion would be, I think so. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Okay, yeah, no problem. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's a normal distribution, so we've got much less happening at the tail ends of the very low and the very high. Most people tend to clump right around the middle, sort of in a moderate level of narcissism. But of course, we always have people who are very low in narcissism, and that's maybe an interesting type of person who's super non-narcissistic, and people who score in the very, very high tail end. So it ends up being pretty close to a normal distribution. So whenever we have studies like this, we have a lot of variability in where people fall. And that's part of why we don't use a cutoff for trait narcissism, because we don't want to say, you know, a score of 30 is highly narcissistic and then a score of 29 is not. So we use the full spectrum of the data to get at narcissism. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's super common. It's about as common as any other personality trait. Yeah, that's a great question. So narcissism researchers used to think that it was more common among men than among women, and that probably makes sense if you look at the list of traits. It's much more easy to envision those kind of traits in the social situation of men based on the way that they're socialized versus women. But in fact, a meta-analysis just came out this past year, I think, looking at lots and lots of studies that looked at gender differences and found no significant gender difference. So men and women are actually pretty equal on narcissism. It tends to follow the same distribution for them. There aren't differences. But of course, there are probably some differences in how it's expressed. So we know that narcissists are very aggressive, but that may come out differently for men and women. So male narcissists may be even more likely to use sort of instrumental, like behavioral aggression to get what they want, versus female narcissists may be a little more likely to use sort of the more passive aggressive. Exactly. Yeah, so I don't have a definitive answer on exactly how that looks, but that's probably, they're pretty much equal, but it may come out a little differently. Good question. Yeah. Oh God, yeah, that's huge. Yeah, absolutely. That's really common, especially if you go to any sort of social personality conferences. There are all kinds of posters on narcissists and selfies, right? Yeah, so that's huge. And narcissists do tend to promote themselves a lot on social media. So that research is certainly ongoing. No. Express better. Right. There is some evidence that narcissism might be increasing. There was a longitudinal study that was published about 10 years ago that showed a sort of a small effect that narcissism is increasing over time. But there are a lot of explanations for why that might be happening that don't necessarily mean that narcissism is actually increasing. Because of course in these studies we always rely on how people fill out the scales. So it might just be more socially acceptable now to indicate a little bit more of, yes, I endorse this idea. So it might not even be a true difference, but there is some research suggesting that it might be on the rise. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's, of course, something we all struggle with, fundamental attribution error. We all make dispositional attributions, and we have to effortfully correct for them. I think that's a great point, and it's been sort of a debate in personality psychology for a while of whether personality traits are stable or if they're situationally determined. For what it's worth, most people who study narcissism do use more of a measure approach to measure what people think about themselves in general, and then look at how that plays out in other personal endorsements or in situations or relationships, et cetera, et cetera. I think it would definitely be worth looking at that kind of a distinction, is how much of this is situationally determined, like how much can situations change the way that you endorse scales. But one answer to that question, Amy Brunel, who's actually at OSU, I believe Mansfield, did a really great study really recently using what's called the bogus pipeline procedure. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It's this really cool procedure where you hook up participants to a polygraph machine. You make them think that you're detecting lies in their responses, and then you ask them questions. So you ask them about things that you might think they might usually lie about. And because they think that the polygraph is detecting their lies, they're going to be more honest. So Amy Brunel used this procedure to give people self-esteem scales and see what they did, and as well as narcissism scales. And interestingly, narcissists, or people will endorse narcissism pretty much equally whether they think that they're being detected for lies or not. So that's maybe an interesting tidbit there. Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, so I'm actually not really up on the research that looks at narcissism in social media, although there's certainly a lot of that. So I don't know whether they control for things like that. I would imagine that they do, but that's definitely one thing where that might come into play. Any other questions? Great, thanks everybody for being here.